Alright, so hello everyone, welcome to the Warframe video, and this one's gonna be a little bit different, because today I'm going to tackle perhaps the most asked question ever. How do you make builds? How do you come up with builds? Why are builds the way they are? I know these are different questions, but they're essentially asking the same thing. How do builds work? How do builds in Warframe work? And there actually is kind of a simple answer to this question. You want to find the right balance of multiplication. Okay, you want to take the damage you have on the weapon and push it through as many different types of damage multiplication as possible. Now there is one exception to this though, and that is status, because status doesn't add any damage up front, but it can add backend damage in the form of slash, heat, gas or toxin, or even increase your damage by either stripping away the enemy armor with corrosive or infecting the enemy with viral, which can essentially make you do double damage in a way, because the enemy only has 50% of their original health while the viral proc is on them. And this is actually the most difficult thing about making builds. Is it worth going for status? And if so, what kind of status? All the other stuff is actually very straightforward, so let's start with that. So as I said in the beginning, the easiest way to think about builds is that you want to take the damage you have on the weapon and push it through as many damage multiplications as possible. Let's just imagine a primary weapon that does 100 damage, because that's going to be easy to calculate. Okay, we take this weapon, we point it at something, we pull the trigger, it does 100 damage. If we then add Serration, which adds 165% damage, we're now doing 265 damage, right? 100 as base, and then 165 added from Serration. If we then add Heavy Caliber, which does the same thing as Serration, it adds 165% of the base damage, and it also reduces your accuracy. The weapon is now doing 430 damage per shot, because the bonus from Serration and Heavy Caliber adds together, which is 330, plus the 100 that we get from the weapon base. However, if you were to at this point add Split Chamber instead of Heavy Caliber, which has a significantly lower multiplier, right? Split Chamber is 90% multi-shot versus Heavy Caliber's 165% bonus damage, we end up with an average damage of 503.5. Why is that? Well, because Split Chamber is a completely different calculation to Serration. It doesn't stack. Okay, so what we're doing now is we're taking that 100 base damage, we're multiplying it to 265 with Serration, and we're then adding in the 90% chance of firing 2 bullets. So now we know that multi-shot is good, so why not add more multi-shot? Let's add in Vigilante Armaments for additional 60% multi-shot, giving us a grand total of 150% multi-shot. This will give us the resulting damage of 662.5 on average. But just like with Heavy Caliber, adding more of the same thing isn't necessarily better, right? So what if we add Infected Clip instead, which adds 90% toxin damage? Well, we get an average damage of 956.65. That is a massive increase. But once again, why? Well, because this is another step in the damage multiplication. It takes all of the multiplied damage, right? So the base damage multiplied by Serration, then multiplied by multi-shot, and adds 90% of all of that as extra toxin damage. This is one of the two reasons why we add multiple elemental mods, right? It's the third step in the damage calculation, so it adds extra damage from the already multiplied base damage from base damage via Serration and multi-shot via Split Chamber. But it also allows us to tailor our weapons for the type of enemies we fight, because every enemy in Warframe has its weakness and its strength. Let's take the Grineer Heavy Gunner as an example. They use ferrite armor, and ferrite armor takes 75% more damage from corrosive. So if we were to add Stormbringer to the weapon, which would shoot our damage up to 1409.8, we enable another step in the damage calculation, which is the 75% more damage taken from corrosive by the Heavy Gunner, if of course we are fighting a Heavy Gunner or a unit that uses ferrite armor. Now this doesn't unfortunately multiply all our damage, we don't just take the total damage and multiply about 1.75, but what we do is we take the corrosive portion, which is 906.3, we multiply that by 1.75, and that is then added to the rest of the damage, which is the impact, puncture and slash in this case. So even though the total damage right now says 1409.8, if we were to actually shoot a Heavy Gunner and that Heavy Gunner would not mitigate any of our damage, let's just say, we would actually do 2089.525 average damage per shot. So tailoring your weapons to the type of enemy you're fighting is very strong. It enables another step in the damage multiplication, but let's just stick to the numbers on the screen to make it simpler, okay? I don't want this to be too complicated. I want this to be, well, understandable. And adding a number that only really works in some cases versus certain enemies and certain missions would make it just unnecessarily complicated, alright? I also didn't want to make it more complicated because now we get into another step you can introduce into the damage calculation, and that is crit. Because up until now the weapon did have a 30% crit chance but a 1 times crit multiplier. So even though you can crit, it doesn't actually do any extra damage. So now I'm going to change it to a 2 times crit multiplier. So if we shoot something and we crit, we are going to do double damage. So you can see that even though I didn't add any mods, our damage has gone up. It went up to 1832.739, and that is just because, well, we now crit 30% of the time, and when we do double damage. Now, the difficult part about this portion is that unlike the previous steps, which will basically work on every single weapon, if you take any primary or secondary and you apply those steps, you will get results. This one doesn't work on all the weapons. Right? Because the weapon needs a certain amount of crit, and there unfortunately isn't a clear line where a weapon becomes crit viable. It's something that you're gonna have to learn and kind of feel it out for yourself, but general rule of thumb is semi-automatic weapons need higher crit than fully automatic weapons. Okay? For me personally, semi-autos need to have at least 30% crit chance, but sometimes I will go as low as 25, and full autos can go as low as 15 if they have enough fire rate. However, that is not the only measurement there, because critical multiplier is also important. If you have a weapon that has a massive critical multiplier, like 300%, it's worth kind of brute forcing that crit chance if it's not quite high enough. But if the crit chance isn't quite high enough, and on top of that the weapon only has, let's just say, 150% critical multiplier, which is below average, yeah, it's not really worth scaling crit in that case. So, we've introduced crit now, but before we add point strike, let's actually add hellfire, to kind of do it the same way we did up until now, because, you know, we know elemental mods are really strong, and we add multiple of them, so what if we add a third one? Well, that will bring our damage up to 2421.834. But if we instead add point strike, our damage is gonna go up to 2467.151. Now, this is not a massive increase over hellfire, it is more, but not that much more. And there are kind of two reasons why. Number one, we're only scaling 1/2 of the crit multiplication, that is crit chance. We're not scaling crit multiplier yet. And number two, elemental mods are just really strong, okay? And kind of the general rule of thumb when it comes to 90% elementals is 2 are really strong, the third one is still really good, and you only use the fourth one if you have nothing else to put on the weapon. Okay, this is a common mistake that I see with people. They scale a crap ton of crit, but they don't have any damage to multiply with that crit. You need some elemental damage, whether it is 90% elementals or dual stat mods, to multiply with that critical damage. If you have a ton of crit damage, but no damage to multiply, you're doing no damage. Okay? Now, this is where crit damage is going to really take off, because we're once again going to put in Hellfire for comparison, which is going to give us an average damage per shot of 3260.163, but if we instead add in Vital Sense for the crit damage, our damage will jump up to 5004.791. And just for comparison, with Point Strike and Vital Sense, we're doing 5004.791 damage. But if we instead add the two remaining 90% elemental mods, that being Hellfire and Cry rounds, for in this case blast damage, which doesn't really matter, which are still really strong. Remember, elemental mods are really strong, that's why we add multiple elemental mods to our weapons. We're gonna do on average 3010.929 damage. Because even though we're adding a lot of damage, we're not taking advantage of the crit calculation. This is why stacking one type of multiplier is bad, in this case the elemental mods, and why stacking multiple multipliers is good. It's the same when you reverse it and you add nothing but crit. Because if I take out Stormbringer and Infected Clip and I put in Argon Scope and Bladed Rounds instead and I tick both the events, that is headshot on enemy and enemy killed, our damage still goes down to 3876.448. And that's because even though we have a very high critical chance, we're actually going into orange crits and we have a massive crit multiplier, the damage we are multiplying with that is, in comparison, very low. And once again, this is the most common mistake that I see people make, whether it is in the comments, when they're talking to me, when they're pitching me builds, they just add too much crit and they have no damage to multiply with that crit. But what if we want even more damage than this? Well, in this case, with this high of a crit chance, 75%, bladed rounds is probably gonna be our best bet, because it's gonna push our damage up to about 7,542.431, which is much higher than Hellfire, which would only give us 6,613.474. And we can also add Argon Scope, which is gonna bring our total damage up to 10,854.051. But that is very weapon specific, okay? This weapon has very high critical stats, so it's beneficial for us to add more critical mods. Right? Wrong. It's okay for us to add bladed rounds in this specific case. But instead of Argon Scope, we're actually going to add Speed Trigger, which is going to increase our fire rate, which increases our DPS, because even though we're doing less damage per shot, we're firing faster. Another multiplier that we could potentially introduce into the chain would be a faction-specific mod, a Bane mod, but those are not very popular because there's a lot of micromanagement going on with these since they are faction-specific, so you have to swap them out between each mission. And in the case of the primed version of these mods, there's also a big wall of investment that you have to first put in to even be able to use them and do this micromanagement. But it kind of depends on the weapon, and it's kind of what I want to lead into. Each weapon in this game is different, so you have to consume all the information that you get from the stat screen, and you have to ask yourself, okay, is it worth sacrificing a bit of elemental damage to run dual stat mod so that I can proc status? The general rule of thumb is, if the weapon has decent status, you want to run status mods on it. Okay, you want to run dual stat mods instead of 90% elementals, because 99% of the time, status procs are better than just raw damage. Especially when it comes to slash procs, viral procs, and corrosive procs. Those are incredibly powerful. You have to look at everything. If you want to use Argon Scope, is the weapon accurate enough to actually reliably hit headshots to trigger Argon Scope? If not, you can't use Argon Scope, even though it would really fit that weapon. Or is the weapon unpleasant to use? Does it shake the screen like crazy when you're aiming down sights? Well, if it does shake the screen, you probably don't want to use bladed rounds either because you're gonna get a headache. Does the weapon have bad ammo economy? Because if it does, you really don't want to add fire rate because you're gonna make it worse. And this is where my regular answer to this question, the very short one, comes in. It's all about trial and error. You learn the basics, which I've hopefully just explained and it was understandable. And then you just try different things and you build up this knowledge base of things that worked on other weapons and you try to apply them to similar weapons you get later down the line. Just go ahead, pick a weapon, try things, just put on random mods, and if they don't work, it's fine. You now know that this particular combination of mods doesn't work. A good example of just random things working, I think, is the Tigris Prime. I was there when the Tigris Prime was released, and when it was released, everyone would use a damage crit setup. And then some people just started faffing around and they started using the slash status setup, you know, the one that everyone uses on the Tigris Prime now. And I remember at the time, a big chunk of the player base was like, well, look at me with my fancy slash procs, just use a normal crit build, you idiot. But look at it now, everyone's using the slash setup, right? And the only reason why that setup exists is because someone went, hold on, I wonder what happens when I do this. And that's how meta builds are made, that's how meta setups are made, right? Someone just goes, I wonder what happens when I do this. Most of the time, it won't work. Yeah, it's dumb, it doesn't work. But that's fine, because sometimes it just does, like with the Tigris Prime. Someone had an idea, they tried it, it worked, and now everyone is using that build. It is the build to use on the Tigris Prime. The same with Atarax, Amprex, anything in the game. Someone tried something new, and it worked, so people are using it now. So to kind of finish the video, because it's been going on for way too long for my liking, it's good to know the basics. The basics are important because they give you a good base for the weapon to work. But you want to experiment, you want to try new things because who knows, maybe the thing you try will be the next thing that will become meta. You're not gonna redefine the meta every week, right? Builds and the meta in general have been pretty well defined for quite a while, but every now and then something ridiculous pops up. And it all starts with someone being curious and going, I wonder what happens if, or something along those lines. So I guess what I'm trying to say is knowing the basics is important, right? It's important to know that you don't want to stack one type of multiplier too much. You want to have as many steps in this damage multiplication as possible, and I hopefully explained that in this video. But it's also extremely important to experiment with things, because if you don't do anything, nothing will ever happen. Oh yeah, and I have no idea how I almost forgot about this, because it's probably the most important thing about this video. You don't kill enemies in Warframe by waving your spreadsheet at them like a maniac. So another really good benefit of knowing how this all works is also knowing which mod you can take out and maintain the most damage. Because at the end of the day, a weapon that you don't have fun with is probably not a weapon that you're gonna use an awful lot. So if, for example, you have a weapon that you really enjoy using, but the reload time is killing you, it's like 3.5 seconds, it's good to know which mod you can take out and maintain the most damage while still adding in reload speed. But anyway, I think I've been rambling for way too long. It's been 15 minutes, oh my goodness. So I thank you very much for watching. As always, guys, I hope you've enjoyed the video and it was helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section down below. I or someone else will most definitely answer them. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.